Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Can we have all the leadership for Fellowship of Believers come up front? Matt, Jackie, Nathan. Thank you. So thank you guys so much for coming. It is an honor to host this as a leadership team. We have a bunch of new faces here tonight that we normally don't see on a Sunday, so it's awesome. We're just going to open up with prayer, and then we will get started. Dear Lord, we just thank you for tonight. We thank you that you have planned this. God, you've set it up. Your hand has been all over it, and we just ask that you would bless it tonight. God, the words that comes out of Howard's mouth would pierce the hearts of many in this room. And we just invite your Holy Spirit here tonight to speak through him, speak through every person that's behind this mic. And we thank you and we love you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah, we just want to say thank you so much for coming on behalf of FOB's leadership team. One of the things that's on our heart so much is, one, partnering with the community and what all God is doing within the community and equipping and training and raising up the next generation, and specifically with CC as a community and being able to pour into our kids. I am a fellow CC mom. I've been doing CC now 10 years. Woohoo! Only got a couple years left, and it's such an honor to see what God is doing in our kids and how he's speaking through them, and they're learning to hear and learning to just be able to hear from the Lord for themselves, to know God and make him known for themselves. And it's just such a blessing to be able to partner with you guys as fellow campuses. I love seeing all the faces from all the different campuses. So we just wanted to say, United Front, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, FOB, for being here also to support CC. We are here to advance the kingdom of God for his glory. And so we just wanted to say welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to pass it over to Micah and Sarah.
What's up, CC and FOB? Woo! And anybody else, if you're not a part of it, you are anyway. So fantastic. We just wanted to take a quick second to, can I have, if you are a CC director in the room, can you just stand up so we can recognize you? If you direct CC, anything, challenge director, foundations director, thank you. You guys are amazing. We love you, we love you, we love you. So honestly, I'm not going to sit here and talk tonight because we are here to hear what the Lord has to say through this man, right? So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to the best decision I've ever made in my life besides Jesus, and he's going to introduce you to the phenomenon that's about to happen.
Thank you. Wow, hopefully I don't disappoint after that. I just want to ask something really quick. How many of you in this room have ever been impacted by Howard Hochhalter? Howard, do you see this? You know better than anyone else who this man is. I don't have to tell you, but for those of you who have not had the benefit of being able to be touched by him and know the passion that lies inside of his heart, let me just tell you this. This man right here, Howard, come up here, man. Come here. This man right here is a personification of the Classical Conversations motto, to know God and to make him known. He has been on a journey with his family, and let's just honor his family right now. Yes. Kristen, where are you at? There you go. Right in front of me. The entire Hochhalter family has been on a journey with Jesus, with us, and I couldn't be more proud to call you friend.
Thank you, Mike.
And so I'm not going to sit here and gab. I'm going to give it over to the gift that is Howard. Have your fun, man.
All right.
Thank you.
You got it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Testing. There we go. I spent the last week trying to figure out how I was going to make this introduction. And I'll be honest with you, I still haven't figured it out yet. So I'm just going to kind of roll with this. I'll begin in the logical way. My name is Howard, and I was an atheist. For a long time. About 12 years ago, I was working in a planetarium part-time. And I was happily living my secular life. I was discovering the universe, fell in love with astronomy, spent a lot of time looking at the stars, talking about the stars. And one day the director of the planetarium asked me if I would be willing to do a Star of Bethlehem show. Sure. Anything that would allow me to use the planetarium in another way, inform people about something, absolutely. I had a vague notion about what the Star of Bethlehem was. I knew it was connected to Jesus. Being a secular guy, I didn't really understand anything about the story. I didn't grow up in a godless home. We didn't go to church. We didn't practice faith. I didn't know who Jesus was. More importantly, I didn't know why Jesus was. So anyway, I dove into the research behind the show. And this is kind of how I used to begin the program, because one of the most astounding things about the discovery in the course of making the program was I started to read about the dates where particular astronomical events happen. And I'll cut to the chase here. We're going to be focusing on a time frame between 7 and 2 BC. And I looked at these dates that were given for certain astronomical events. And it said, on the 20th of May in 7 BC, there was a beautiful conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. So I punched that date in, and of course, I saw nothing. There was no conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. And I punched in every single date, and every single date came up with nothing. So me being the secular person that I was, of course, I said, of course. And then I realized, when we think of a calendar, 1 BC, what's the next year after 1 BC? 1 AD. But if you're counting numbers, what comes between -1 and 1? 0. And so there was a year 0 in the software, and I had to account for that. And so when I accounted for that additional year, everything fell into place. Now, my journey to faith, I couldn't even begin to spell it out tonight. It goes way beyond the scope of the show. I'm here to talk about the Star of Bethlehem, and I want to give you a little bit about how I arrived at where we are today with the Star of Bethlehem, because it transformed my life. It's how I came to learn Jesus. More importantly, why he came. When I learned about the stuff that happened, you can see over here we have a timeline behind us, and it's very, very small right now because there's so much information. The previous show I did, and I did this for about 11 years, everything you see on the right-hand side, I forgot I have this. People are going to get distracted with the laser. It's the lightsaber. This was my previous show right here. All of the light blue represents astronomical events. All of the green represents historical events. And what we did was we correlated the two to reveal what was the Star of Bethlehem. And if you've ever been to a planetarium show where they talk about the Star of Bethlehem, they entertain all kinds of notions. They talk about, was it a supernova? Was it a comet? And they don't really spend a lot of time talking about what is the Star of Bethlehem. They talk about what it might be. And what they do is they show you a lineup of usual suspects of astronomical events and kind of talk about it being in a mystical place where it could be any one of them, and they don't really define it. And that's not the kind of show that I wanted. I seek answers. So I dove into this, and what I saw was a remarkable series of events. And I'm going to follow my wife's lead. She told me I should use this as a metaphor. I imagine that if I were a foreigner and I came to the United States and I knew nothing about this country, and I looked up one night and I saw a whole lot of fireworks going on, I might be stupefied by what I saw. And then someone might explain to me that it's the 4th of July. Awesome, you do fireworks on the 4th of July. Why? It's our nation's birthday. And I might think that that's a really cool thing. And that's what the Star of Bethlehem was for me. But if you're a curious American, especially a new American, you might want to know, what does that 4th of July really represent? And there's a much bigger story, and there's a whole lineup of characters. I apologize if I don't look much over here because that's really bright. I like to make eye contact with my audience, and I just realized I'm shying away from here. It's because of that. In any case, what I saw in the course of studying for the show were a series of fireworks, and what it fed in me was a curiosity about understanding, what does this all mean? Because the lining up of the astronomical events were so astoundingly precise. Even as a skeptic, it's really hard to look at this as an accident. It's like dropping a bowl of beans and they spell out a symphony. I don't see how this is an accident. Anyway, someday we'll talk more about my journey over. I'm happy to say that I'm here. And I want you to see part of what it was that brought me here, because it's pretty compelling. And for those of you that have been here for a long time, I'm a newcomer to this place. I don't mean this church, but I mean to a position of faith and spirituality. I'm new. And so I want to apologize in advance. I don't know a lot yet, but I'm learning real fast. And what I see is astounding. And I know I remember when I first looked through a telescope the first time and I saw Saturn. It started me on this journey. That's part of what put me here. I looked through a cheap plastic battery-operated telescope on a rickety mount, and I saw Saturn for the first time with my own eyes. And at 10:30 at night, I wanted to go and beat on everybody's door in my neighborhood and say, come out and look at Saturn. You got to see this. I was so blown away. And that's how I feel about this. I want to run around the world. I want to tell everybody about the Star of Bethlehem. Not because of this event. It's like fireworks. It reminds us of something. And I didn't know what it was reminding us of. Now I know. And I want to tell everybody what it's all about. So this is part of my research. I'll explain this in a way that will try to make some sense here. Timelines for me allow me to see how things play out in time, quite literally. And so it gives me ability, because I think very visually. I wanted to see, I conflated things. I had no idea where people were in history. And if you don't know where they are in history, you really can't understand them. If you didn't know that George Washington came before Abraham Lincoln, you're going to have a tough time understanding American history. So in the same context, if you want to understand who Nebuchadnezzar is and what his role is, you got to look back into the history. And what I found was that I felt like I pulled on a thread. Actually, I'm going to use the Christmas tree. I love my Christmas tree animal. The Star of Bethlehem, quite literally, is the star that's on the top of the Christmas tree. But if you follow it down the tree, there's a story that goes back chronologically. I don't have the time to take us all the way back to the beginning at the bottom of the tree, which starts over here with Abraham. All I'm going to stick to are the things that are prophetic and have to do with the messianic arrival. So as we look, this timeline represents everything from Abraham to right here, the crucifixion. And this is everything in between. And I'm trying to wrap my head around this history here. It's at this time, actually that's kind of bright. I'll use my mouse. You see what happens as I zoom in, we lose everything else. We're at the time of Moses here. Moses has brought his people over. They've crossed the Jordan. They've already taken out a few kingdoms here. This is important because it's the first prophetic view of a Messiah comes here with Balaam. Now, he's known for the story of the talking donkey. But Balaam is an example of the way I see this is there's several lessons here. Balaam is a guy who is asked to curse the Israelites by King Balak. He's the king of Moab. And I know I'm going to dive into this and I could spend hours talking about this. I have to try to do this quickly. God tells Balaam, no, you're not going to curse the Israelites. You're going to bless them instead. And he does this 3 times. But what Balaam's mistake is that he recognizes that God told him not to do this. He recognizes the power of God and then turns his back on him later, which is why Balaam meets the fate that he does, which is he meets the sword later. What Balaam represents is it's a moral lesson in doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. But it also shows us that God sometimes uses wicked people to do his will. And in a very prophetic way, what Balaam did in almost in a trance-like state, he says, this is Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh or close. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Sheth. He says this in a trance-like state, and I didn't understand what all of this meant, except I had to look this up. This is how I operate. I now understand who Jacob represents. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. And Jacob's 12 sons represent the 12 tribes of Israel. His 12 sons, one of which is Judah, which creates the house of Judah, the kingdom of Judah that we're going to be following along here. Now, we move right into this period here. This is time of the book of Judges. I say this like I know all about it, and I just only learned about it a few days ago. Most of this I just learned a couple of days ago. The book of Judges, I wanted to understand something because sometimes I tell this story like nobody knows how it ends, and I remind myself everybody knows how this ends. The reason why it was important to understand this is because Jerusalem is punished later on. Jerusalem is destroyed. In order to understand why Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is destroyed, you have to understand what begins back here. The clock is ticking. The covenant has been made with God. 6 days of toil, 1 day of rest, 1 day of the Sabbath, 1 day for the Lord. And from this time period, from the book of Judges, all the way to here, to this guy, they have broken the covenant. It's 490 years in violation. And the payment is 70 years. And this is what begins what's known as the Babylonian exile and the destruction of Jerusalem. God's punishing Jerusalem for their sin. And this, since I've said it and we've cut to it, this is the essence of what I learned. God sent Jesus to the earth for our sin. What the tribes of Israel are learning here is they can't make up for their sin. They keep sinning over and over and over again. What we have here, the blue represent good kings, the orange represent bad kings. If you're not familiar with the kings, in the northern tribes, I don't remember how many kings there were, but none of them were good. Not a one. And in the tribes of Judah, David, Solomon, well, David and Solomon are technically part of the united Israeli kingdom. It's after Solomon that they break up and you see the two separate kingdoms. Once they separate, House of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, has a couple of really good kings. Hezekiah is one of the greatest. Unfortunately, his son is one of the worst. Manasseh sets the stage for Jerusalem's downfall. And I would love to dive into the scripture here. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, the reason why he's weeping is because he knows what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And he's pleading with the kings here. See, as we zoom in, this is the last good king in the kingdom of Judah. Josiah here is the grandson of Manasseh. Manasseh rules the longest. He rules for 55 years, and he is an extremely corrupt guy. Without going into the gory details, he brings idolatry back. He builds temples to Baal. He brings back child sacrifice. He sacrifices his own children. He rules for 55 years, and his son Amon takes over. Amon is just as bad as his father, and he rules only for 2 years. And he's murdered. He's assassinated by either his servants or other close associates, who are then in turn, they are killed by the people of Jerusalem, and they appoint his son Josiah king. Josiah is the last good king in the kingdom of Judah. Josiah is 8 years old when he takes the throne, and this is where things really start to change. And I wish I didn't have to race through all of this, because I really want to spend some time here. This is important to point out. Micah exists in the time period of Hezekiah and Manasseh. Micah, this was a question that I asked when I've been giving the show for a few years, and I never made the connection. How did the Magi even know? How did anyone know that Jesus, the Messiah, was going to be born in Bethlehem? I didn't understand this. I was a secular guy, so how'd they know this? Well, it was the prophecy of Micah. 700 years before Jesus' birth, Micah prophecies right here. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is the ruler in Israel. I say this because this is almost a consolation, because what he's saying here in 5:1 is that Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. He's talking about what's going to happen. And he's saying this in the time of Hezekiah, when there is no reason to worry at that point. They have a good king. They worship God. They're obedient people. But what Micah is seeing is the future. And what he sees is the destruction of Jerusalem. And as a consolation, don't worry, Bethlehem, you're going to produce the Messiah that's going to save us all. Now, I have to bring this up, even though it doesn't have anything to do with the Star of Bethlehem. This just simply floored me. So Isaiah, during the time of Hezekiah and into Manasseh. In fact, if you're not familiar, does everybody know the fate of Isaiah? He was cut in half by Manasseh. Manasseh was a bad guy. But what Isaiah did, he predicted who was going to free the Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity 150 years before. Before there was ever a problem, before there was a Babylon. Isaiah names Cyrus. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but the guy who frees the Jews from Babylon is Cyrus the Great. And he is a benevolent leader. He's one of the most recognized, humanist leaders of the past in the ancient world. He had a habit of observing and respecting the faiths of his conquered people. He let them practice their religions. And the first thing he did was free the Jews. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I wanted to point that out because it's chronological. This is back in 700 BC. Now, Josiah becomes king, and Jeremiah is now speaking on behalf of God, and he's warning Jerusalem about what's going to happen. Historically, I wanted to fill this in, but it was going to take a lot. What's not obvious here is that there's a lot going on historically here. This is the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and if you're not familiar with them, they're not really good. They are really, really evil. Even by ancient standards, they are brutal. They're suppressing people. They're suppressing the Babylonians so bad that the Babylonians want to rebel against them. And so this is ultimately what's happening. Some of you, I know that the CC community know this because I remember hearing the songs about Ashurbanipal. I know CC students probably are singing the Ashurbanipal song in their heads now, but Ashurbanipal, he dies in 631 BC, and that is the decline of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Now how does this tie into the Star of Bethlehem? It's all about the shifting power struggle right here. So Assyria, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is collapsing here. They're starting to fall apart. And when Ashurbanipal dies, Nabopolassar forms the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. These are the Chaldeans. And together, Nabopolassar, the first king of the Babylonian Empire, and I'm going to bring this up, Cyaxares, I can never pronounce that right. He's the king of the Medes, and King Nabopolassar, they formed together, and they've been attacking the Neo-Assyrians, destroying them. And ultimately what they do is they sack Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. They wipe it out. Now, excuse me, I meant to leave that up because I can't say his name either. Since I literally just found out about him last week. So, Sinsharis, the king of the Neo-Assyrians. He's killed in the battle, and his son, Ashur-uballit, becomes the king. He escapes from Nineveh and takes his entourage to a city called Haran. It's part of the Assyrian Empire, and he establishes a new capital there. This is why I don't have my glasses on. It's at this time, and this is why I bring up Habakkuk here. Habakkuk is a prophet who speaks to God. He doesn't really speak to the people. It's not an opportunity for God to speak through him, through a dialogue to the people. It's just simply a dialogue between this guy and God, which makes this so remarkable. And Habakkuk is probably like a lot of us today, and they're looking around in our society, lamenting what we see, wondering how long and how much more of this must we endure. Habakkuk laments the state of the kingdom of Judah and asks God, why are you tolerating this? And God's answer is, for lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. Now, I read this in a metaphorical form, and I wish I could give credit where I read it, but it struck me as just astounding. The covenant was about, when they speak of the covenant, it's spoken of as if it's the soil and you're using the soil. We till the soil and we toil over the soil for 6 days and then we rest on the 7th. Well, they haven't been observing that, and they've been abusing the land for 500 years. And the metaphor that I read was, it's like a garden, and the soil needed to be plowed. And when the soil is plowed, it digs up huge clods. And then you bring in the clod breakers, and they break up the clods and separate the rock, and now the soil is ready to be planted again. What God saw was Jerusalem needed to be plowed. And he brought in the clod breakers. And this is I get goosebumps thinking about this. The Hebrew word for Chaldean is Kasdim. Kasde. I may butcher the pronunciation, but ultimately it's their term for clod breaker. So the Babylonians are the clod breakers that God is sending their way. Habakkuk, of course, doesn't like this because the Chaldeans are bad people. And he asked God, why are you sending them, these unrighteous people, to punish us? And God says, don't worry, I'm going to punish them too. But the point is, and I think this is one of the lessons, is that Habakkuk has to accept this. This is God's will. Now, after the Battle of Nineveh, the siege of Haran begins. And this is only significant because it has a great impact on the kingdom of Judah. What happens at Haran, this is this is the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Babylonians have sieged this city and taken it. This is when the siege begins, and then eventually they capitulate. This is essentially the end of the Assyrian Empire. Ashur-urbal then requests help from his only ally, which is Egypt. And he sends word to Pharaoh Necho and says, send an army, we need help. So that's what Necho does. Necho marches up and brings his army up through the Levant. He's got a navy off the coast. He's marching up into northern Syria. And who does not want to see someone help the Assyrians? King Josiah. Because he's one of the kingdom of Judah has suffered under the Assyrians as well. And what they see is their horrible enemy about to get destroyed. And they don't want to interrupt that. So Josiah marches his army out to meet Necho. There's Josiah, there's Necho, and there's poor Josiah after he got hit with an errant arrow. And he was taken back to Jerusalem, mortally wounded, where he died. And that was the end of the kingdom of Judah's participation in the Battle of Megiddo. And Necho goes on up to fight against the Babylonians at Haran. And they fail. They fail to break the siege at Haran, and they come marching back. And for all intents and purposes, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is gone. If they're still around, it's kind of like the Wile E. Coyote just floating there until he realizes the ground is gone and then he disappears. So they're essentially wiped out from history. Necho marches back, and on his way back, he stops by in Judah. And since Josiah has been killed, his youngest son, Shallum, has been made king, and he takes on the name Jehoahaz. You'll notice he's orange. He didn't last very long. He lasted 3 months. He was king for 3 months. And then Necho comes down and says, well, I don't know if he said this. I'm going to depose you. That's what he did. He deposed Jehoahaz, essentially saying, I don't think you're going to support me as well as this guy is. And so he appointed his older brother, Eliakim, who took on the name Jehoiakim. He becomes King Jehoiakim, and Jehoahaz gets taken prisoner back to Egypt, and that's where he spends the rest of his life. And he's gone from the story after this. King Jehoiakim, on the other hand, has all kinds of mischief to get up to. He's another very bad man. He's an adulterer. This is the kind of guy who has guys killed so he can steal their wives. He's a very bad man. He abuses his power. So Jehoiakim is now the king. Now, this is okay, there we go. I have to find myself. I apologize. Now, Jehoiakim is the king of Judah. This is in 609 BC. The Battle of Carchemish is where things are finalized in the Levant. The Battle of Carchemish, what this establishes, Egypt's no longer the strong boy on the block. There's a new gang. There's a new power. This is when, I have to go back to this, because he says it right here. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans. What does that mean? He brought them up to be in power. And that's what happens here. Nebuchadnezzar destroys the Egyptian army at Carchemish. They pull out of the Levant, and Babylon is the supreme power here now. They have been raised up. And once Egypt is out of the Levant, oops, there we go. This is what happens when you're too zoomed in, or not zoomed in enough. There we go. The kingdom of Judah surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar shows up with his army. And King Jehoiakim, he's smart. He doesn't want Jerusalem to get destroyed, so he surrenders immediately and offers fealty to Jehoiakim, essentially saying, oh no, I'm not with the Egyptians anymore. Because remember, who appointed him? Necho. He's Necho's guy. Now he's saying, I'm Nebuchadnezzar's guy. And so this is what we would refer to as the first siege of Jerusalem. It got spared. And the only thing that happens is Nebuchadnezzar takes some treasure and royal family members, one of which happens to be Daniel. And again, since everybody knows the story, I'm just going to cut to the chase. If you want the Magi to show up and validate the birth of the Messiah, then you have to send them Daniel 500 years before. This is the crossover. Daniel is God's spokesman amongst the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are God's tools. He uses Nebuchadnezzar as a Chaldean, as a Babylonian, to smash Jerusalem and teach him a lesson. And then later on, 500 years later, he uses the Chaldeans to validate the Messiah. They're his tools. And Daniel here, if they're a tool, makes them useful. So Daniel, he's a young guy when he goes over. This is where this is where my show used to begin. I wish I could spend more time in the history, and if we can open the floor with Q&A, I would love to dive into some of that. But this is where we really jump into some interesting stuff, because now Jerusalem is getting close to meeting its fate. That's the first siege of Jerusalem. Nabopolassar dies. A few months later, he's the king. He's the first king of Babylon. He dies, and immediately the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar is made the king. Looks like a lot of time goes by. That's 605 BC. Now we're into 604 BC. I put this in there just because I know if you're familiar with the prophet Jeremiah and you're familiar with the time frame, this is what's happening. This is what's going on. And this is what blew me away, is that I was aware of the prophets. I didn't know that they overlapped. I didn't know where they met up. And it's like finding out that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson knew each other. Meaning, if I was watching the fireworks and I'm learning about American history, I'm learning who these people are. And so this is what I find so astounding about this, is that they all overlap. That's why I wanted to include that in there. Now, this is important to understand, because I never saw this for what it was. I just saw it as an event that validated Daniel as a magi, but I didn't see the purpose, and now I understand the purpose. The purpose was to make the magi validate the Messiah, you need to send them Daniel. And if you're going to send them Daniel, he's got to do something to earn that place. And so what happens here is Nebuchadnezzar's having a very, very bad dream. I don't even want to call it a bad dream. He's just having a dream that he's struggling to understand. And he turns to his magi. The magi now these are really, really, really smart people. The Chaldeans themselves have an academy where they are the masters of these arts, in particular astrology, study of the stars, nature. To the degree that they do in the ancient world, the Chaldeans are the masters of it. The Romans refer to this. I wish I could have some sort of supporting evidence here, but you'll see that they'll talk about it when in throughout history, throughout the Roman Empire, when they refer to certain people and their skills, they will say he was trained by the Chaldeans, the Chaldean astrologers, or the Chaldean astrologers follow Zoroastrian astrological tradition. And so there's constantly references to the Chaldeans and where they get their skill. They are among the best in the world. And so Daniel is enrolled in this academy. He's training. He's 2 years. He's only about 15, 16 years old. And he's in this program, and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he tells his magi, I want you to interpret my dream. And the magi, of course, okay, what is your dream, King Nebuchadnezzar? And he said, no, I want you to interpret my dream, and I don't want to tell you what it is. You're the magi. You tell me what my dream means. Well, their power was a little bit limited. And this upset Nebuchadnezzar. And, well, he ordered them executed. Just get right to it. He ordered their death. This included Daniel, because he's part of the order now. And Daniel is just a trainee. So when Daniel hears this, he asks for an opportunity to interpret the dream. And Daniel that night prays to God and asks God, what is Nebuchadnezzar's dream? And God tells him what his dream was and what it meant. So Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was. His dream was about a giant statue, a statue of a man made of metals. The top of the statue was a head made of gold. Followed by this was a shoulder and arms of silver. Then I believe it was a stomach and thighs of brass, and then legs of iron that merged into the rock and the soil of the earth. And what this represented were the great empires of man. In the top, the golden head is Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. And the others are subsequent empires of man, which we know today, at least what we believe is the iron represents Rome, the last of the great empires, which was then broken up and it became the kingdom of God. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, I like this artwork here because it shows Nebuchadnezzar and the exasperated magi pleading for their lives and a young Daniel explaining his dream. Nebuchadnezzar is pleased with the explanation and not only spares the lives of the Magi, he appoints young Daniel as the head of their order. I would imagine that if you're a Magi and you've been a Magi for 50 years, and here comes this 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid who suddenly becomes the head of your order, you might be upset, except the fact that he talks to God and God answers. So they recognize his greatness and they recognize his power. And this is how Daniel becomes one of his most revered members. I say this because later on, I want everyone to think about this. If you went somewhere and you represented God and someone made you in charge of this order, would you not use God to direct them? I say this because what happens 500 years later is that the Magi respond to the prophecy of Daniel. And the question I used to ask was, why would the Magi, why would these Babylonians, these Persian astrologers, why would they care about a Hebrew prophecy? Because of Daniel, their greatest member. And so what we have, moving through time, I got to move forward here. King Jehoiakim, go back to him. King Jehoiakim is a bad guy, and he's kind of two-faced. And what happens is, I have to sort of explain this. Nebuchadnezzar tries to invade Egypt. He gets too big for his britches. He's not happy with just the Levant. He wants to spank Egypt. And I would say that goes beyond the purview of God. He said, I raised up the Chaldeans. He didn't want the Babylonians to take over the world. And so they try to invade Egypt, and they get spanked. And that so badly that it actually causes the Babylonians to look diminished in power. They look bad. And they have to limp back. And this causes Jehoiakim to think that there's a shift in the power base and he can go back and switch allegiances. And Nebuchadnezzar comes to siege Jerusalem a second time, and he shows up. They begin the siege. It's during the siege that King Jehoiakim is killed, and there's different accounts of this. I've read two different ones. One, which is, I don't have my Josephus book. No, that's okay. It's okay. I was just going to, since you brought it up. Josephus, if you want ancient history, straight from the mouth of the guy that was there. Josephus says that Nebuchadnezzar killed Jehoiakim and his officers and tossed him from the city walls. And another account says he was killed by raiders that were acting as Nebuchadnezzar's proxies. Either way, Jehoiakim dies, and it's during the siege. And then his son, Jeconiah, is made king. And unfortunately for Jeconiah, he had a fate a lot like Jehoahaz. He ruled for 3 months, and then he was deposed. He surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar, and this is interesting to note. Jeconiah, there's actual records of Jeconiah's presence in Babylon. They have pottery records of showing rations to him and his royal family as prisoners. He's real. He's a real guy. And he was eventually freed, but he chose to stay in Babylon much later. He was treated very well. All right. So Jehoiakim is killed. Jeconiah is deposed and taken. And then Nebuchadnezzar appoints his uncle, Zedekiah. And I think maybe some of you might know Zedekiah. He's a bad king, and he's the last one. And he's appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the third siege of Jerusalem, moving along here. Zedekiah, bad king, decides to side with Egypt again. He looks to Pharaoh Hophra. Egypt is just not a really good friend to have. Nebuchadnezzar responds by sieging Jerusalem a third time. This time, this is the thing to understand, he appointed Zedekiah. So this is a different kind of a betrayal to Nebuchadnezzar. He's been betrayed by someone he appointed. So his fate for Zedekiah is going to be a lot worse. And Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is leveled. The city is leveled, brick by brick, knocked down. The wall is knocked down. There is no more city. Zedekiah is taken to Hilah, I can't remember its name now, where Nebuchadnezzar has his sons executed before him, and then his eyes plucked out, so it was the last thing he would see. There's a prophecy that talks about this. In fact, I risk extending this by going back here. This is where I show my lack of knowledge. Well, Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar takes the entire population of Jerusalem back to Babylon, and they're all prisoners. He leaves Jeremiah. There's a small contingent of people, very poor people, to tend to the farm fields. That's about it. In other words, the soil is going to get to rest for 70 years. This is the Sabbath that God demands. This is the punishment. This is the beginning of the exile. Not the real beginning. They actually were trickling over in the first siege and the second siege, so there's no real definitive time where it begins. I think if you're asking me when does the 70-year clock begin, it begins when Josiah dies, because at that point Jerusalem is like a dead man walking. The kings are all bad. Its fate is predetermined. According to Jeremiah, Jerusalem is going to suffer its fate because of the sins of Manasseh. That was before Josiah, meaning there's nothing that Josiah could do, anyone could do to save her from her fate. Now, Nebuchadnezzar dies. There's a series of kings, and the Babylon Empire wanes. They've served God's purpose. The Chaldeans have raised up, and now they are diminished. And here comes Cyrus the Great. He is an Archimedean king. And he sacks and wipes out the Mede-Persians. This was King Cyaxares, the one who sided with Babylon and to help defeat the Assyrians. He takes them on and takes them out. He takes out the Lydians, and then he takes on the Babylonian Empire and invades and almost basically sacks the city almost without a fight. The Babylonian Empire is gone almost overnight. Now, Cyrus the Great is known as a kind ruler, and he respects the faiths, the religions of his conquered people, and so he immediately releases the Jews to go back to Babylon. This is in 539 BC. I say this because as we get right here, this is near that time frame where we get to the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and this is important because this is where we get straight to the Star of Bethlehem. The prophecy states that after a week is not 7 days, a week is 7 years. Each day represents a year, and 70 weeks represents a total of 490 years. And the way the prophecy is written, what Daniel says is, upon the command to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, the countdown begins, which ultimately ends with, in 490 years, the anointed one, the Messiah, will be cut off. That's when Jesus is crucified. 490 years from the command to rebuild Jerusalem. This is where it's never as clear-cut as we want it to be. There's several decrees to rebuild Jerusalem. The first one starts with Cyrus. He says, go back and rebuild your city. Go back. But the first communities that go back, and it's not everyone, they're just trickling back, they start to reestablish themselves. They're starting to build their buildings, but there's no real city yet. Later on, what ends up happening, I know there's some conflict, but I'm just going to stick to what I know. King Artaxerxes' decree is the third decree biblically. It's the second decree historically, but it's the one that matters. Because according to Ezra, now this is straight out of Ezra. This is chapter 7, verses 11 through 28. I've only picked the relevant ones because they speak directly to about Jerusalem and what he wishes. Now, this is the copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave unto Ezra the priest, the scribe, even a scribe of the words of the commandments of the Lord and of his statutes to Israel. And I, even I, Artaxerxes the king, do make a decree to all of the treasurers which are beyond the river, that whatsoever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, shall require you, it be done speedily. In other words, he's greasing the wheels for Ezra to get things done. Whatsoever is commanded by the God of heaven, let it be diligently done for the house of the God of heaven, for why should there be wrath against the realm of the king and his sons? This is in 458 BC. Now, the Jews have made their way back to Babylon. They're rebuilding Jerusalem. At this point, by 458 BC, they start to rebuild the walls, and what you're on your way to is what's known as the Second Temple, which technically doesn't really near completion until the time of Herod. So it's a work in progress. It's never really done. But it's essentially established, and the city isn't a city until it has its walls, and that's really when it completes, when it's completed, and that's what Artaxerxes is responsible for. Now, there's this long stretch of nearly 500 years, and we get into this period here. And this is the part where I would normally just dive right in, but I want everyone to see the astronomical part of this first, and we'll come back to this. So what we're looking at here, the light blue events represent astronomy, and the green represents history. And they are listed chronologically. And if I could, I would have put up all the significant astronomical events so you could see the drib, drab, drib, drab, drib, drab, and then all of a sudden this downpour of things that's happening right here. My dear friend Ed is right here, and he and I both know we're avid astronomers, we're avid observers. So how many of you remember when they talked about the Christmas star, they said Jupiter and Saturn were coming together so close that you could see them together in the field of view of a single telescope? That was back, what, Ed, that was in 2020? December 2020. Everyone got really excited about that. And it happened once. In 7 BC, it happened 3 times. And that's not all. There was a lot of things. This is what I mean by the level of precision. The amount of meaning behind the things that are happening in this period is overwhelming for a secular guy to interpret. I'll tell you a funny little story. The first year I did this show, the very first year, I was still a 100% I'm an atheist. But 85% of my audience was Christian. And when I gave the show, my Christian friends in the front row jumped up to shake my hand. I don't think they knew I was an atheist. But the show did nothing to diminish their faith. But what I found amusing was the only people that walked out of that show confused were the secular ones. Because I presented nothing false. Everything was real. What I presented was just the astronomy. And what even they saw was so astounding that they expected some level of debunking from me. And I remember saying this, just the facts, ma'am. It's just the facts. All of these are facts. And so from a secular eye, it was easy to see this and just go, wow. But now as I see it as a Christian, it's like watching fireworks over Baltimore Harbor. As an American, you know, it really does stir the soul. Nothing has made me feel closer to my Creator than the time that I have been spending researching this. This is why I want to share this with you. So now I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit off subject here. I want to get to the astronomy part. So we're going to pop this up here. This is kind of what we've been waiting for. All right. See, now everyone's going to know what happens when you ask Howard a question. So what we're going to see here is a series of astronomical conjunctions. And I want to explain what a conjunction is. This is now I get to be the astronomer. So a conjunction is when two completely disparate things that have nothing to do with each other pass by and get really close to each other. So if you think about this, in a world where 90% of everything stands still and 10% moves, what's going to be the most interesting thing? The thing that moves. So when you look up into the sky, guess what 99% of everything is doing? Standing still. If it looks like it's moving, it's because we're the one doing the turning, right? The Earth is doing the turning, and so you see the stars rise and set, but the stars themselves are always in the same position night after night after night after night, relative to each other. But it's the planets that do all the moving, and they happen to move along a very particular path. It's called the zodiac, right along the path of the ecliptic around the sun. And here's an interesting parallel. There are 12 constellations in the zodiac. How many numbers are there on the face of a clock? 12. And the constellations have things that move through them that tell you certain things. And guess what a clock has? It has arms. And when those arms move mechanically, people who observe them interpret meaning by what they are doing relative to each other and the place that they are on the clock. And some places where those things are relative to the numbers mean more things than they do when they're somewhere else. I remember 2 o'clock, or was it 2:20? Gosh, it's been so long, Kelly, you have to help me. I remember when the bell used to go off in high school in the 6th period, and 2:35. I was looking, 2:35. That clock, when that alarm went off, it straight out the door, right to the parking lot, get to my car and drive home. It was end of school. And so you can see where you could understand what symbols, when they come together, how they mean celebratory things. So the sky and the universe is like a giant set of gears and clocks, just an internal mechanism. They are moving irrespective of who's looking at them. So the Magi have been looking at the stars for probably 1,000 years. They were looking at the stars for hundreds of years before Daniel comes along. Now they're looking at the stars after Daniel's come along, but they're looking at them with a different eye, and there's something else. And it's also important to understand this. One thing I used to tell people in the planetarium is, this is the hardest thing, you have to unknow what you know. Meaning, if I mention Jupiter, what pops into your head? Great red spot. The Galileo probe. In other words, it's a gas giant. We're familiar with it. Guess who didn't know it had a red spot and was a gas giant? 2,000 years ago, they had no clue. The very word that we call these objects planets is from the Greek word planetes, which simply means wanderer. So there are stars, and then there are wandering stars. And remember, which ones are the interesting ones? The ones that move, and they move along a path. And if you are a diviner of the future, you pay attention to the ones that move, and you notice where they go and where they are. And you try to understand what's happening. So here, let's describe it this way. If you're playing poker, it's helpful to know what the cards mean, right? And so what they're seeing is they're watching these things that come together that have enormous symbolism. And to the Magi, they are not the things that we think of them today. When you look up in the sky and you see Jupiter, we know Jupiter. Oh, that's right. That's the Roman god, who is the Greek god, which was actually a Babylonian god, which was a Sumerian god, which was a Mesopotamian god. And it keeps going back. And this is the whole point, is that you go back to the time of the Magi, they're looking at the same object and it holds the same realm of influence. Meaning, who is Jupiter? The same as Zeus, who's the same as Marduk or Marduk or whatever. He's the king of their pantheon. He's the king star. And so it's what these objects represent. It's like saying if you're playing chess, does it matter if it looks like a European king or a Chinese king? It doesn't matter. It's a king, right? And so that's what these symbols represent in the sky. So Jupiter is the planet of kings. Saturn is one of two malefic planets. In an astrological sense, what this means is they have a sphere of negative influence. They're not positive, they're negative. Now, and that's not to say that they are, this is how they're kind of interpreted. Mars, of course, is associated with, because of its red color, the god of death. And in fact, in the Babylonian sense, it was associated with Nergal, the god of inflicted death, meaning not you tripped and fell on something and got and hurt and died. It was somebody you made somebody angry and they cursed you. And something happened to you, and that's what caused you to die. That's the god of inflicted death. He's a bad guy. And Venus is, while the Roman and Greek interpretation is love and beauty, if you go back to the ancient Babylonian sense, it's motherhood and fertility. It's more reproductive love, not she loves me not, she loves me not. It's not, it's ancient world, and so they have a different set of priorities. When they see these objects come together, it's important to understand what they mean, so you'll see the significance of this. So what we're looking at here is, and before I forget, don't forget, remember I told you about the astrological calendar, or astronomical calendar. There's a year 0. So when you look here, it says 6 BC. It's actually 7. Does that make sense? So don't be confused by that if you see me. I'll say 7 BC and it clearly says right there 6. I'll always be 1 year off. So I've started a little bit early. This is April 25th. What I'm going to take you to is the first astronomical event. These are the Magi now. They're making their observations in the early morning hours, which is known as heliacal rising. If you actually look at the Babylonian star charts, the cuneiform, written in rock, they carved it in there. They have heliacal rising tables, meaning they know when to expect to see objects rising up ahead of the sun in the early morning. The thing to remember is, if objects enter the sky, believe it or not, there is an entrance and an exit. And it's hard to comprehend this, but if you think about it right now, if you go outside, and we look outside right now, you might see Orion up here, right? Well, in a few more months, where will Orion be at this same exact time? It'll be over here in the setting sun, right? Makes sense? And eventually what will happen is it just simply disappears and you don't see it. Now it's gone behind the sun. And so you could say it's exited the celestial screen, so to speak. Well, that means when it enters, it's popping out the other side just ahead of the sunrise. Does that make sense? So it's beginning its trek. It's rising into the dark sky just before the sun rises, and then the sun comes up. And the next day it's a little bit higher, and a little bit higher, and a little bit higher. And so it's important to note that that's when they made their observations, in the early morning. So in the early morning, they're looking up and they see some familiar objects doing some things that they don't normally do. Now, it's not to say they just suddenly showed up. It's like watching two continental plates collide. No one's surprised. Meaning, here's Jupiter, here's Venus, here's Jupiter, next day after day after day after day after day. You're like, they know, they can tell what's going to happen. So what they see here is Jupiter and Saturn low in the eastern sky. And we're going to take this to May 29th, 7 BC. I'm just going to click day by day. So on May 29th, Jupiter and Saturn come really close together. This is the first conjunction. Jupiter represents, it's the planet of kings. It dictates all the business and the influence, the future of future kings. Saturn, not from various cultures, agriculture, fertility, it represents a lot of different things. Ninurta in the context of Babylon, but specifically in the relation to the Jews. Does everybody know what day of the week is named after Saturn? Saturday. It's not a coincidence. Does everybody know what the first day of the week is named after? The sun. And then the next day of the week? the moon. It's the brightest objects in the sky. They named the 7 days of the week. Sunday, Monday. In fact, what we call a month, you could call a moon, because it's based on the lunar cycle from one phase to one full phase. It's a month, 28 days. And so, I got lost. What was I saying? Oh, Saturday. Sorry, that's where I was. If you know me, this is par for the course. So intellectually, what happens is if you're running down a cornfield, I know exactly where I'm going. And then somebody says, hey, what about 2 rows over? And I go running over a couple rows. I go, oh, yeah, this. Which row was I in? And then I forget where I was because every row looks the same. All right, so Jupiter and Saturn come together. Saturn represents, in the context of Hebrew, because it represents Saturday, what important thing happens on Saturday? The Sabbath. So here's something interesting. In Hebrew, does everybody know how to say Sabbath in Hebrew? Shabbat. Do you know how to say Saturn in Hebrew? Shabbatai. They're very closely associated. So Saturn, even in the ancient world, is known as the protector of the Jews because it is associated with dominating the day of Saturday. That's their holy day, and Saturday is defined by Saturn, which, interestingly enough, in the ancient world, in Arab and Greek cultures, they looked at Saturn as a malefic planet, and the influence of the malefic planet on these people made them malefic people. It started a little bit of the friction between the cultures. They looked at them as being dominated by this evil thing, which was Saturn. Funny is that they didn't think of it in that own sense. So to the Magi, they see the planet of kings is meeting the protector of the Jews. And where does this happen? I'm just going to put up all the constellations because it's just simply easier. That's Pisces right there. I didn't know this until just a couple of days ago, but I knew this a long time ago. Pisces in the ancient world is just a symbol for fertility. Fish is fertility. But in particular, Pisces, the fish represents the 12th month in the Hebrew calendar. It's called Dagim, and it literally means fertility. That's right out of the Hebrew calendar. So remember, now the Magi have this Daniel connection. So they see Jupiter and Saturn coming together. They've seen these things come together before. This is the significance of a triple conjunction. So they're watching, you can imagine, what's the sky revealing to us? Jupiter and Saturn, the planet of kings and the protector of the Jews, have just met in the constellation. It's like the big hand and the little hand just met in the number 2. What does that mean? Well, to the Magi, it may be telling them something important about this prophecy that they're aware of, but they need to see more. So now we fast forward the clock. I'm going to take this back to 3 a.m. and move it forward to September 29th. In fact, I'm going to back the view out a little bit so we can... Oh, by the way, the closest terrain that I could find that looked like Babylon is the surface of Mars. So that's the Mars rover right there. My apologies, that's all I had. And let's get rid of the artwork. So September 29th, you can see Jupiter and Saturn will separate. They move apart. Moon comes by. We'll do this one at a time. There we go. As we click, they come together again in another really, really tight conjunction. Again, this is all happening in the constellation of Pisces. Now, as you'll notice, as objects keep shifting, they're moving into the west. So it means they're rising earlier and earlier and earlier. We saw Jupiter and Saturn the first time at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now I have to back the clock back because as time goes by, it's rising early and early. I'm going to take this all the way back to 7 o'clock. So 7 o'clock in the evening, and now we're going to take this to December 8th. December 8th, 7 BC. And Jupiter shifts away. I'll bring this back into the view. Whoops. I went past it right there. December 8th, 7 BC. Well, we can bring this in. not too terribly close. Jupiter and Saturn in 2020 came so close that you could see them in the same field of view. That was astoundingly close, but it only happened once. So this is the third conjunction. Now, I kind of joke around with my wife about this, and there's no real principle behind this, but I always used to think that if you do this, you hear that, you might think that something just fell. If you hear this, you might think something fell and then bounced. But if you hear, you know somebody's at the door. When the Magi are looking, what they see frequently, what Ed and I both know, what we frequently see in the sky, if you're an observer, is you see conjunctions all the time. It's like saying, yeah, I see the arms of the clock passing each other all the time. But every once in a while, they pass each other at a particular place and they symbolize something important. And it's easy to think about a clock. There's only 24 hours. We're talking about a clock that spans cycles of decades. It takes Jupiter 12 years to orbit the sun. It takes Saturn 29 years to orbit the sun. So when you talk about orientations where the two line up, it takes a lot of time for that to happen over time. So to see a triple conjunction is a significant event to the Magi. They've seen the king planet meet with the planet that is known as the protector of the Jews 3 times in the constellation associated with fertility. Not to mention, they also know that the time that Daniel is referring to, known as the 70 weeks, prophesying that there will come a Messiah, this Jewish king. They know they're in the right chronological ballpark. They know they're in that right time frame. Now, as if to add more significance to this, we're going to move the clock to February 20th, 6 BC. Oops, let's take it off of that so we can... We're going to look in the low in the western sky. You'll see it. There's Mars coming up. One day back. There we go. This is called a massing of the planets. I can promise you this, if this were outside right now, we'd have our telescopes set up. If you could look into the sky and see 3 planets and the moon all in one little chunk of the sky, we'd all be out looking at this. What this represents in an astrological sense is a giant agreement of purpose. And what we see symbolically is the planet of kings, the protector of the Jews, and Mars, which reveals danger, deception. Now, if the Magi are uncertain about what they're seeing may be leading to prophecy, what they see over the next 18 months removes all doubt. And this is arguably the most astounding display of astronomical events that has been seen in the last 2,000 years. I don't think anybody could ever point to anything that has been seen in recorded history that surpasses the quality of stuff that happened in this very short time frame. So now what we're going to do is advance to May 10th, 3 BC. I'm just going to go ahead. We're going to take that to 4:30 a.m. So I'm going to just make adjustments here. You can see this would have been a lot easier in a scripted planetarium show. May 10th, there we go. We're going to get this to oops, wrong way. So now we're looking at May 10th, 3 BC at 4:30 in the morning. We want to be looking to the east. There we go. So we see the moon, Venus, Mercury. Actually, I like to show this because it shows the ecliptic path. If you could see, you could connect a line from Mercury to Venus to the moon to Mars, and then you see that path in the sky. It's where the arms of the clock pass through. This is the ecliptic path, and all the constellations that are associated along that are called the zodiac. So May 10th, 3 BC, and we're going to move 10 days. Barely visible there. The glow of the sun is there. This would have been very challenging to see. But what we see is Mercury and Saturn come together. Now this, Saturn, we know, is the protector of the Jews. Who is Mercury? Mercury, to the Romans and to the Greeks, this is the fleet-footed messenger god. But to the Babylonians and to the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, this is Nabu or Nebu. And he's not necessarily a messenger, he is a scribe. He is the scribe of human destiny. What this guy writes about you is your future. He writes down the destiny of humans. And the scribe of destiny is now meeting with the protector of the Jews. That's on May 20th and 3 BC at 4:30 in the morning. Now I'm going to back this up to 4 o'clock because we're going to take us to the next step. This is what happens. The sky keeps adjusting, and I don't want the sun to get into our view. And we're going to go to June 13th. And there, Saturn and Venus just come together in this really, really tight conjunction. Saturn is the protector of Jews. And who is Venus? Love, fertility. In the Roman sense, she's love and beauty. In the Greek sense, she's love and beauty, sort of a Western application. In the ancient Mesopotamian world, she's reproductive love and fertility. She's motherhood. This is why when you look at the old idols of Ishtar or Inanna, who Venus represents, she looks like 6 or 7 water balloons taped together. She's very motherly, very shapely. It's a different priorities. So that's Inanna. That literally is Venus. Venus and Saturn, the protector of the Jews, meets with the planet of motherhood and fertility. And this is where I remember I was looking at my wife and said, I wonder what constellation it was in. What constellation is it? Does anybody recognize that little V-shaped grouping of stars right there just preceding the Pleiades? Taurus. In the Mesopotamian world, do you think bulls are important? They're very important. What does this bull represent? It's called the bull of heaven. It represents, in their sense, one of the most fertile places in the sky. It's about reproduction. So we see the protector of the Jews and the planet of motherhood and fertility talking about fertility. We'll get rid of that artwork. And now, August 12th. And if I had a music, it would be picking up in tempo right here. This is August 12th, 3 BC. And for those of you that have been patient all the way through this, I promise you, this is where it really starts to get good. We're going to go to August 12th. August 12th at 4:30. So I'm going to give myself 30 more minutes and push that up a little bit higher in the sky. You can see, oh, look, I gave it away. There's Jupiter coming. And as we add time to August 12th,
that would really be bright.
The sun is the brightest object in the sky. The moon is the second brightest object in the sky. That's number 3 and number 4 right there. Saturn and Venus have come together in such a tight conjunction. The planet of motherhood, the planet of fertility, meets the planet of kings. And in what constellation? That's the Lion of Judah. The Magi see this and they understand. See, they see this through a Hebrew prism. And I think that that's what a lot of, I would say, secular people or historians might reject because there's no way to validate that. There's no way to prove it to them. Daniel isn't even a real person. He's a fictional person. I just find it interesting that it's the Magi that show up, and then I have this connective story that says that there was this Jew that went over there that told him things. That's the connection there. So the Magi are seeing this. They're seeing prophecy is unfolding before them. The planet of kings and the planet of motherhood and fertility meet in the Lion of Judah. This is the first time it happens. And how many of you are familiar with Matthew when he says about the Magi, where is the King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east at its rising. This is at its rising. And I told you, heliacal rising, what they're talking about is just preceding the sun. It's just coming up. This is what the Magi saw that I'm sure convinced them that prophecy was happening. They saw this, and then what happens afterwards? It's frosting. I'm getting goosebumps because I'm getting very excited about this because it gets way better. In fact, this is the next step. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the artwork here for a moment. Actually, here. We're going to advance the clock right into the daytime. I'm going to set this to 12:30, so we're going to be at midday. This might be funny. You'll be like, well, what are we looking up in the sky in the daytime for? What biblical prophecy has anything to do with the daytime sky? Does anybody know? Does anybody recognize that date? The September 11th, 3 BC. I would hate to cut away, so I'm going to try to do this from memory. Revelation, chapter 12, verse 1. In the sky, a woman clothed in the sun, with the moon at her feet and the 12 stars a crown, as she's about to give birth, with the serpents surrounding her as if to devour her newborn child. That's the woman clothed in the sun. Let me make this easier. I apologize for this behind-the-scenes wizardry here. So I have to do this. I have to turn off the atmosphere, click that, and then I'll only get that one. And then I can put the atmosphere back on, and now we get that pretty picture. That's the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin. This is a Western application. This is what we have done subsequently. To the ancient world, I promise you, the Babylonians didn't look at that and go, it's the Virgin. To them, this was the furrow. Not a furrowed brow, which I'm very familiar with. It's the seed furrow. It's where a plow has gone, and it's where you put your seed. And the sun sitting in the womb of the woman in the sky with the moon at her feet. Not only is that the moon, this is what I call a divine double entendre. That's a very young moon. It's almost, you could say, a baby moon. In terms of astronomical photography, a new moon is like a dead moon. It's dark, there's nothing there. And the moment the light starts to become visible, that first little sliver, that's a young moon. And what photographers try to do is capture the youngest moon they can. And the pictures I've seen are maybe 20 hours old, 24-hour-old moon, and you get this little sliver. Tiny, it's a baby moon. This moon is about 30 hours old. It's an infant moon. This has contextually nothing to do with the narrative. It wasn't recognized by the Magi. It's only in Revelation. But what I wanted to point out is, does everybody understand what's happening on this date? September 11, 3 BC. This is the day Jesus is born. I know this sometimes it's kind of hard to understand this. It will make a lot more sense when we get back to the timeline. because then you see how this fits in with history and you go, oh my gosh, it's been in front of us all along. So the woman in the sky clothed in the sun, what I want you to also see, look what's around her. Here, right below her, this, it's convoluted with all the artwork, but starring doesn't make it easy. That's Hydra. Here, in the secular sense, what does Hydra mean? Water snake. In mythology, what was the Hydra? 7 heads. Go read Revelation, and you'll understand what I mean. But here's where it gets really interesting. This one blew me away. Over here, this naked guy wrestling with the snake. That's the constellation of Ophiuchus. He's the snake wrestler. The rest of the snakes, those are 2 constellations called, it's serpents, the snake. It's serpent's head and serpent's tail. It's the only constellation that's broken in half, like part of it's here, part of it's there, and then a whole nother constellation in the middle. Well, back in the Babylonian days, there was 3 different constellations, and they were all serpents. And one of those serpents' names means red snake. Read Revelation, and you'll see what I mean. This is why I wish I had the words up here. So September 11th is the day that I believe Jesus is born. Now, we're going to go and watch something amazing happen. I'm going to take this now to 4:30 in the morning. So we're going to say goodbye to this. Oops. And we're going to take this to September 3rd. We're going to go backwards in time because what we just saw, I pointed out, was the birth of Jesus. What I wanted you to see was what's happening as we lead up to this, because astronomically, the Magi are not in Bethlehem. The Magi are far east. What they're seeing happens to coincide with his birth. And this is where I gotta grab this. Nathan will know why I was asking about this earlier. So on September 14th, here we are. See where Jupiter is? Let's put this up here. See, by this point, Venus has separated away from Jupiter. Remember where it was? They were just joined together right there in Regulus, in Jupiter. That star right there means, well, Regulus, there's its name. Regulus means in Latin, it literally means little king or the prince. It is the royal star. It is the first star in the constellation. It's like saying that's January 1st. It's the beginning of the astrological signs in the sky. It's the very lead one. And that particular star falls right on the ecliptic path, meaning the sun moves directly along that same line. That's Regulus, the little king, and it is the brightest star in Leo. It's also known as Alpha Leonis. It's a significant star. And Jupiter goes into conjunction, not once, not twice, 3 times with Regulus. The planet of kings meets with the star of kings 3 times in the Lion of Judah, 2 days after Jesus is born. I can't blow this thing, but it's like a bell ringing in the sky. Immediately after September 11th, Jupiter goes into conjunction with Regulus and then separates and comes back, and then separates and comes back, and then watch what it follows up with. So now we're going to go to September 14th. The first conjunction, Jupiter is practically inside that little reticle there. Jupiter and Regulus have merged together. So the Magi see this. At this point, I have to believe they're already convinced. This one's just packing cherries on top for them. But this is less confirmation and more celebratory. This is my own personal opinion. I believe this is when they'd be honking their horns and ringing bells, because the king is born and Jupiter and Regulus come together 3 times. This is the first time. Then February 17th, 2 BC. So watch, I'll pull out a little bit. Jupiter moves away, as it normally does. Oh, and I got to turn back the clock a little bit because otherwise we're going to run out of horizon. So February 17th. You can see how far apart Jupiter and Regulus are. They've clearly moved away. Not only have Jupiter and Regulus gone into a conjunction, we've got a nice little moon parked right next to it. So Jupiter and Regulus have gone into a conjunction now twice, moved away, come back together, moved away, come back together, and about to do it for a third time. I'm going to move the clock back now so you can see we're so far into the western sky. This is how far Jupiter has moved, and it's 2:30 in the morning. So now I'm going to move it back to 8 o'clock. Only because I just need to give myself some more celestial real estate up there. All right, now we're going to take this to May 8th. Oh, there we go. May 8th. This is the third conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus. Clearly, to the Magi, you and I know, because I told you, that Jesus is born on September 11th. When you put that into context, September 11th he's born, and then 3 days later, Jupiter and Regulus 3 days later it goes into conjunction the first time. And then a few months later again, and a few months later again. This is what the Magi have been witnessing. And then to cap it all off, I'm going to show you what ultimately is the thing that you see on Christmas cards. The bright star in the sky, low in the western sky. We see the three guys on the camels, the distant bright object, this beautiful image. I'm going to show you it's real, just sans the guys on the camels. So what we do is we're going to move forward to the day of the Star of Bethlehem. Is June 17th, 2 BC. Here, look who's coming back up. So I want you to remember this. Heliacal rising, Jupiter rises up and meets Venus on its way down in the morning, and they merge together. Venus and Jupiter separate. Jupiter comes and merges with Regulus. Jesus is born, Regulus, Regulus. Venus moves in the other direction, pops around the other side of the sun. And 9 months later, after Jupiter has trekked from the eastern to the western sky, touching Regulus 3 times, and as it comes down into the western sky, Venus comes marching up. Out of that low in the western sky, comes marching up. Here's Venus. This you would have needed a telescope with a pretty good aperture and a nice magnification to split that. But to the human eye, essentially, if you exclude the sun and the moon, which are in a class all by themselves, so in the nighttime sky, these are the 2 brightest objects, technically speaking. And they just merge together into a single object. The mistake to make is to think that the Magi weren't paying attention, and all of a sudden, one night, there's this thing that popped up. It wasn't like that at all. It's like you're watching a plant grow. You're watching the fruit appear, and you're watching the color change, and then it becomes the thing you're expecting it to be. But the garden is a poor analog because you know what the fruit is going to do. Here, the Magi had no idea. And I think that that's part of what we get excited about, is because what it reveals is something truly amazing. And you wouldn't have known it initially. They probably were filled with doubt. But eventually what they see is so much certainty and so much precision and very, very pointed right at the facts that deal with the prophecy. This is what makes it really hard to ignore for me. So June 17th, 2 BC, this is the Star of Bethlehem. Low in the western sky, this very bright object is attracting the Magi. You could imagine them seeing this. If they haven't left yet, I have a feeling they're about to. Now, we get to another massing of the planets. I'm going to take this to 5:10 in the morning. So pop this forward by 10 minutes, and then, 5 in the morning, and we're going to take this to August 27th. You can see it's getting darker as we get a little bit earlier. Oops, I'm looking north. Here in the east, we get another colossal massing of the planets. In all of my years of observing, which really hasn't been that long in the grand scheme of things, but I've never seen this. I've never seen a massing of planets. There we go. So low in the eastern sky, 4 planets: Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, and Venus. And let's put this into an astrological sense. It's the planet of kings, it's the planet of danger and deception, it's the planet of human destiny, and it's the planet of motherhood and fertility. All of this converging together in an astrological interpretation. This is an agreement of purpose. Now, this last part really, I've been thinking long and hard about this. I showed it in my previous shows. I'll show it to you, but it was really hard to talk about this in historical sense because it comes right out of the songs, and we hear this where the star stood over Bethlehem. Now, I think everybody knows this. If a star were up in the sky and it's over Bethlehem, guess what else it's over? Everything on planet Earth. Right, it's way up there. That wasn't a terrestrial object that floated down into the sky and hovered over Bethlehem. But what I love about this is that where you see this suggestion of fire, this biblical smoke, so to speak, when you look, there's a spark, there's a fire of truth to this. So everybody knows that stars don't move, right? And everybody knows that planets do. But you will hear people say, stars don't move and stars don't move and then stand still. That's what planets do. And Jupiter did precisely that. It's called retrograde motion. I diminish it when I talk about it and describe what's actually happening. But to the Magi perspective, what Jupiter simply did, here, let me describe it this way. Let's say you're an observer and I'm a planet and I'm moving around the sun. And as you're observing me, I'm moving around the sun. So clearly you could see me moving laterally. But as I start to move in my curve and I start to move towards you, I'm moving. But if I'm moving towards you, you're getting no sense of lateral motion. So it looks like it's standing still. So Jupiter was in a place in the sky and the Earth was moving into a place where it looked like it was coming straight towards us. And so what happens is we lost all sense of lateral motion. And for 6 days, Jupiter stood still in the sky in a very particular place. And in the early morning hours, if you're looking, but what I love is one of my favorite Christmas songs was "We Three Kings of Orient Are." I wish my grandmother were here because she would laugh because that was the song we sang terribly. But I always remembered this part was "Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light." And it was the westward leading part, and I remembered that. And as I'm playing this out, you watch Jupiter just go from the east to the western part of the sky. Here it is. This is where it happens. We're in the eastern sky. I'm going to lock onto Jupiter. There it is. Now I'm just going to make time go by. I'm going to try and bring it down so we could see it maximally. Here we go. Click, 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 click. There goes Jupiter. Rising up out of the east. We had another conjunction with Venus. Oh, I went too far. I wasn't paying attention. I went right into December. So I wanted to stop right about here because this is purely a coincidence because what day was Jesus born? September 11th. But the day that the Jupiter goes into retrograde is December 25th. It's just a coincidence. So in order to reveal this, I'm going to lock onto one of the stars, because as we start to move around the screen shifting, it's hard to tell when it's standing still. So there we go. I'm going to click onto this star, Zaniah here, and lock onto it. And now as I add time, you're going to see Jupiter. It's going to look like Jupiter. I'll use my laser. Looks like Jupiter's going to go like this and then swing around. But when it's swinging around right here, that's when it seems to stop. So it's right around the 25th. So I'll just watch the days go by and take it to the first week of January. You just watch Jupiter and you'll see it kind of stand still. Right there. And I did that really fast. This is why I was reluctant to show it. Right about there, you can see it's happening. Right here, it's standing still. So as I click, it just keeps its relative position between those 2 points. And to the Magi who are looking, Jupiter looks like it's standing still. So we'll take this to the December 25th just to get that nice, pretty view. And you can see, I imagine at this point, if this has anything to do with the song, anything to do with the stories, that the Magi have arrived. Now, I did the calculations and I did the research. If you were to travel from Babylon to Jerusalem on the trade routes that were there, at the time that it was Ezra. Ezra was the one who mentions this. He talks about how long the journey was. It was 4 months. It was a 4-month journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. That was in 700 BC. No, 500 BC, somewhere around that time frame. So when we fast forward to right around the time of the birth of Jesus, trade routes are a little bit more opened up, so it's not quite as long as 4 months, but would have taken several months to get there, a couple of months. And more importantly, here's another thing. I don't want to just, some of the veterans of my old shows will know this, but the Magi did not likely ride camels. Magi riding camels would be like heads of state riding in, I can't think of a Honda. It'd be insulting, but you would imagine if you're a head of state, you're going to be riding a Cadillac, you're going to be riding in a limousine, right? The Magi they're not low people. These are very prominent people, and they would have been riding horses. Now, maybe their baggage trains would have been carrying, their camels would have been carrying stuff, but that's the point, is that what you see in the Christmas cards with 3 guys riding camels all by themselves, not likely. There were probably a lot more than 3 Magi. I think it's just symbolically easier to say 3, just like it's easier to say 3 Knox. It's just a nice, convenient way. They wrap it up by naming the 3 kings. I have a feeling there was more than 3, and these Magi would have been extremely important people. And when they showed up in Jerusalem, imagine in a small town, some rock star shows up. Everyone in town is going to know. And when the Magi show up with their big, massive entourage, they look like foreign kings. Everybody in Jerusalem knows. And when they show up, they're coming and they're asking for directions. And here, where they have arrived, if it fits the story narrative, I only put this in there because I can't verify this, but maybe in our minds we could find some peace with this. But I can imagine the Magi in Jerusalem asking where Bethlehem is. Well, it's 1 hour to the south. And if you're in Jerusalem and you're looking out to your sky at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there's Jupiter right above Bethlehem, standing still as they were looking at it. Not mean standing still in the sky, meaning as they tracked it from day to day, they could tell it keeps standing still in that part of the sky, in the southern sky. It's not shifting from its position as we look at it from here. And from a Magi's orientation of objects they know constantly move, to them, they've been following it westward. And when they get to the place where they're close, it suddenly decides to stop moving as if to say, hey, you're here. And that really happened. Now, can I say that the Magi really saw it and it really played out that way? I don't know. But I hear from songs that the thing stood still and people laughed at me when they say things don't stand still. And I go, yes, they do. They do. But you have to see this from a different perspective and not in the sort of the legendary eye that some of the songs lead us to believe. Now, this last part, this is the last astronomical thing I'm going to show. If you go and look up right now, if you looked up the Star of Bethlehem in Wikipedia, if you look up anything that talks about, there's one person, his name is Herod. Herod is a significant historical person because the way history was written back then, they didn't have timelines, or excuse me, the way the measuring clocks like we do today, and saying, well, what day did such and such event happen? I could say, well, it happened this day and such time because we have record keeping. But back then, they didn't. And so they would say, something happened in the 5th year of this person's reign. And this thing happened in the 7th year of their reign. And then, well, his reign coexisted with another reign. And so there's some point where they can measure, and then from there they extrapolate. So what we do in the ancient world is when you find a historical event that occurred with an astronomical one, then we can bore in very precisely. And there happens to be a very precise astronomical event that occurs right before Herod dies. And for many years, if you look this up right now, when did Herod die? I promise you, it will say 4 BC. But when did I tell you that Jesus was born? September 11, 3 BC. And all of these things that happen in the sky happen perfectly with that birth date. But if you bump Herod's death back to 4 BC, guess who's already born? Jesus. And then none of these things are meaningful. And I literally read that today on a secular interpretation of the Star of Bethlehem. They go out of their way to marginalize and minimize the things. And then when they actually acknowledge the things that happened, they go, but Jesus was born before Herod died, which was in 4 BC, so none of this even matters. Because they want you to think that. I don't want to say they want you to think that. It's easier for you to believe that Herod died in 4 BC because then it makes it harder to prove that Jesus is real. Because the moment you realize that Herod didn't die in 4 BC, he died in 1 BC, all of a sudden, everything fits perfectly. So there is one lunar eclipse. This is right out of history. You can read it in Josephus. He talks about it very meticulously. In the temple of Jerusalem, the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed, the temple that Cyrus the Great sent the people back to build, the temple that Artaxerxes helped to finance and sent all this gold and silver and all the treasure back and said, build your temple. That temple. Here's one thing that people don't know. Herod was a bad guy, but guess what he was also known as? The builder. Some of the greatest structures in Jerusalem are because of Herod. And Herod spent a lot of time and money building up the temple. So Herod, to honor Rome, Herod, by the way, isn't even a Jew. He's Idumean. I don't know if I'm saying that right. He was resented by the Jews being appointed by Rome. And to honor Rome, he takes a giant golden eagle and puts it up in the temple. And, well, this, of course, upsets the Jews. And Herod is also at this time very sick. I won't go into details, but he's a horrifyingly diseased man. He's earned his fate. He's a very bad guy. And he's near death. Everyone is suspecting that Herod is going to die soon. And so there's this rumor that goes out that Herod died. And what did these young radical Jews in the temple do? They immediately saw their opportunity. If Herod is dead, we're going to go take that stupid golden eagle down and destroy it. And they took axes and they chopped it up. And the captain of the guard saw this and arrested everybody that didn't run. He arrested 40 of them, 2 rabbi and 38 of their followers. And what did Herod do? He burned them all alive. And on the night that he burned them alive, there was a lunar eclipse. And then 2 weeks later, Herod was dead. It's interesting, the chain of events that leads to his death. But the marker that I believe that marks Herod's death, that fits this whole entire narrative, is represented by the lunar eclipse of January 9th into the evening, the evening of the 9th into the morning of the 10th on 1 BC. And this is important to note because the 4 BC lunar eclipse, when Herod died, there was a massive funeral procession. Herod wanted to be mourned. It was important for him to be accepted. And so what Herod did was he kidnapped a whole bunch of important people from prominent families all throughout Judah. And he wanted them all executed when he died. Why? Because then everyone would be sad. He wanted his whole country to mourn when he died. He wanted it so badly he was willing to create another sense of sadness to artificially create it. Thankfully, that never happened. When he died, I forgot who it was, whoever it was that was taking over after him, they rescinded that. They released those people. What Herod did, he eventually, when he died, this funeral procession took weeks to organize. People, militaries, and dignitaries from all over came, and they marched his body from town to town to town, taking him ultimately, I think it was around 25 miles away. It would have taken weeks and weeks to do this. And it's horrifying to think about. They kept his body covered in honey as sort of a preservative to keep him from putrefying, so that the public could view him as they moved him around. And the 4 BC lunar eclipse only allows 4 weeks for this to happen, meaning the planning, the execution, the time travel, and there just simply isn't enough time because immediately what follows the funeral is Passover. But on January 9th, that lunar eclipse, there were 12 weeks between that and Passover, and it fits perfectly. So what I'm going to show you is the lunar eclipse. It happens to be January 9th and 10th, so it's just right around the corner. So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to back up the clock to 12:30. Right about there. And I'm just going to move the clock forward. And you're going to see the full moon come into the sky. Oops. There it is. It's already beginning. You can see the eclipse. So if I go backwards, we can see the full moon effect. So about 1/4 midnight, you could actually say right around midnight, the moon is passing into the shadow of the penumbra, and then the umbra shows up right there. And you notice the stars popped into view once the moon was blocked out. And this is when it goes, as lunar eclipses do, nice and blood red. In that darkest core, we get that in the center, and we'll be right in the heart of the shadow, right about there. Yeah, there we go, 2 o'clock sharp. The moon is in the shadow of the earth. I believe this is the one that is recorded by Josephus as occurring on the day that the rabbi were executed. This would be January 9th. What happens is a chain of events, and if you want to follow it, read Josephus. He breaks it down. Josephus talks about Herod. Subsequent to this, Herod, his son plotted to kill him. His son Antipater. He plotted to kill his father. He sent couriers to Rome to go get a poison. It's interesting when you read this. It's like court reporting. And Quirinius is there. Quirinius is this Roman, I think he's the governor. He's a witness to this. And they bring in the poison, and here's Antipater. He's declaring it's not poison. I didn't do this. This isn't me. I have nothing to do with this. And they say, bring in the poison. And they have a condemned man in the room. And they give the condemned man the poison. And guess what happens to him? He dies. It was poison. And so it's obvious to Quirinius that he is guilty of this. And so Antipater, ultimately he's going to be executed. They need Caesar's approval. What happens is Herod goes into a suicidal fit. He tries to kill himself. And someone intercedes and stops him, and in the process starts screaming. Well, when they hear screaming and the king is near death, everyone thinks the king has just died. And his son is in jail. And when he hears this, he tells his jailer, free me. I'm going to be the new king. I'm going to promise you all kinds of things. And the jailer promptly goes right to Herod and tells him what he said. And if you read Josephus, he's so distraught that he beats himself about the head and then orders Antipater to be executed immediately. And then 5 days later, Herod is dead. He dies himself from his own sickness. And that ends that chapter. But what happens here, and I apologize for my long-windedness here, because I left something out on purpose. We go back here. Here we see the chronological listing of events. There's the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. There's the massing of planets. And here we see the interesting overlay of history. There's the protector of the Jews meeting with human destiny, meeting with love and fertility. There's the Jupiter-Venus. And here we see the Augustus decree for registration of Pater Patriae. The question is, what was Joseph and Mary doing in Bethlehem? They were in Nazareth. Why would they be here? And this is a phrase I like to use in science. It's a Carl Sagan quote, so please don't be offended. But I like being able to quote Carl Sagan in a church. I think that's wildly ironic. Carl Sagan said, if you want an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. I like to take that notion and say, if you want Joseph and Mary to be in Bethlehem to fulfill prophecy, then you must first create Augustus Caesar. Again, this goes back to prior planning. If God wants the Magi to be there to validate the baby Jesus, he sent Daniel 500 years before. Remember, who was the one who made the prophecy that Bethlehem will produce the king? Micah in 700 BC. There's Mary. She's carrying the king. And she's in Nazareth. And how do you get down to Bethlehem? Well, you need Augustus Caesar to declare not a census. And this is where secular deniers will say, there was no census in Judea until 6 AD. You're wrong. False. Well, my thinking on this is like saying that you believe someone was attacked by a wolf because of their wounds. And then someone says, no such thing as wolves in this region, they've been extinct. You're false. Well, okay, it was a coyote. The truth is something was attacked. You cannot deny that. And that's what they're trying to do, is to say your mistake denies the truth here. That's not what's happening at all. So Pater Patriae is this title meaning father of the country. Augustus Caesar, almost you could say like God, wants our love. But he can't earn it the same way. He has to demand it. The Senate wants to give him this title, Pater Patriae, that coincides with this interesting time period. Rome is experiencing, at the same time all of this stuff is happening. This is pretty amazing because it gives you a choice. You believe this or do you believe that? And it's about faith. Because Rome is experiencing its 750th anniversary. It's the 25th anniversary of the rule of Augustus Caesar. It's the Silver Jubilee. It all happens in 2 BC. And he is being awarded the title Pater Patriae. It's like the Medal of Honor. It's the greatest award you can give to a Roman emperor. And it's given by the people. And what Caesar wants is he wants his people's approval. He wants them to vote for it. He doesn't want the Senate just to give it to him. He makes everybody show up in their home of record and enroll their affirmation for this title. It's like saying, yep, I'm for it. I'm for it. He wants the people to agree. So the decree goes out in August of 3 BC. In Caesar's own words. Here. I'll pull this up. This is called the Divine Deeds of Augustus. He wrote it. Right? He wrote it himself. This was what makes it powerful because it's his own words. I'll go down to it's the last entry. When I administered my 13th consulate in 2 BC, the Senate and equestrian order and Roman people all called me father of the country. And here's the critical part. And voted that the same be inscribed in the vestibule of my temple in the Julian Senate House and in the form of Augustus. It was awarded in February of 2 BC. There's only one more month in front of that that's still in 2 BC, and then you're in 3 BC. When was this decree sent out. It was sent out in August of 3 BC. The praekos went out. The praekos are Roman heralds, and this is how word is spread really quickly. So they travel out, they go out there. Once it's from the centralized location, it disseminates very quickly. It doesn't take that long when you're not in a caravan. So it doesn't take months and months and months. It's maybe a couple of weeks. So they immediately go out, and the decree goes out. Everybody that's anybody, you must report to your home of record and roll your affirmation. Well, Joseph, he's a descendant of David, meaning Bethlehem is his home of record. And so he has to go back. The penalty for not obeying can be severe. And this is why a man whose wife was 8 months pregnant in Nazareth, and yet he put her on a donkey and marched her 12 days, 11 days ride, going really slow in the mountains, knowing that wherever she goes, that's where she's going to give birth, because they have no other choice. They are compelled by Augustus Caesar because they have to fulfill prophecy. And that's what takes them to Bethlehem. And when do they arrive? Where do we go? I'm in the year, I don't know, 1,000,000 years ago. This is a really long, I'm 5,883,000 years ago. I don't know how that happened. Holy cow. Okay, that was a mouse click. All right, nice moment of levity there. All right. So the decree goes out in August. They arrive in the first week of September. 10 days later, Joseph and Mary's about to give birth. So this is why they're in Bethlehem. And here's the decree in August. And there is September 11th. And there is the first conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus. And the second, and the third. And it coincides with the silver jubilee of Augustus and the title of, this is a coin that actually symbolizes, there's his title, Pater Patriae. This is a coin that was minted in 2 BC for this event. There's the 750th anniversary of Rome. So it was believed that April 21st, 751 BC is the birth date of Rome. It was probably maybe a couple hundred years before that. It's sort of blurry, and it's just the date they officially picked. Now, and then you get there's the Jupiter-Venus conjunction, there's the massing of the planets. At this point, by the time the Magi arrive, there's the lunar eclipse of Herod, January 9th, and there's Passover. By this point, Herod is dead and Jesus is born. Now, I'm going to wrap this up real quick and take you to something I never showed before, but it suddenly became very relevant. There's the crucifixion. And this date, April 3rd, 33 AD, at 3 p.m. This is critical because this happens on a Friday. And this is Luke chapter 23. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. That's the very next day. And there are no other dates right before Passover that fall on a Friday, like this one does. More importantly, Artaxerxes, the command to rebuild Jerusalem that Daniel wrote of, the second decree historically was 458 BC. And when you add 490 years to that on a calculator, it leads perfectly to this date. It actually says 491, and I thought, oh, so close. And then I remembered, oh yeah, year 0, subtract 1. And now it's back to 490. The 490-year prophecy, you can see. Again, I go back, this is like an ink blot. I see a lobster and somebody else just sees an ink blot. This is where I believe it's all faith. If I could validate, if I could prove God existed in the stars, if I could prove it, well, then you would be a fool not to believe. And I think if God wanted it to be that easy, then he would put it in the stars. But then what he wouldn't have is our genuine, unconditional love. We always have the choice to not believe. And I think that that's the critical thing here, is that what this little story presents right alongside these wonderful things where the bells are ringing, symbolizing the birth of Christ. You and I see that. At the same time, Rome is celebrating. And if you're a secularist, you could say, well, duh, because it's for Rome. And this is why nobody in the world at the time paid any attention to Hebrew prophecy, because what they saw was an affirmation of Roman power. It was obvious. Rome was the power. And if you were in the United States, I'm going to kind of break my own metaphor here. If you were in the United States and it was in the month of July and you saw fireworks, you'd probably be safe to assume it must be for the 4th of July. But if you didn't and you weren't aware of a deep-seated prophecy that said something else about fireworks in July, you wouldn't know the challenge. And I think that this is what makes it so interesting, is that over 2,000 years, nobody remembers the connection to Rome, but we still remember the connection to the Messiah. And as I look deeper, what I've discovered is the rest of that iceberg. This is the part I wish I could explore more in the show, but it goes so deep and I've already talked for so long. I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I know all of you are probably anxious to get out of here, but this is my favorite part. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yeah. What's your question?
You did a good job.
Oh, I'm sorry, what was that?
It's okay. You can say it again. You can say it again. You did a good job.
Thank you very much. I like those kind of questions. Oh, we have a question. What's your question?
You're doing a good job.
Ah, thank you. Thank you very much. You guys are too kind. Does anybody want to challenge me? I'd like to draw a line in the sand, if that's what it takes. I see you. The Seatsmas.
Right here.
Okay, question. Yes, ma'am.
This is not a challenge, just a question.
Yeah.
I think you said he was born in 3 BC, but died in 33 AD. That would make him 36 when he died.
He was 34 and 5 months. So you have to remember, he was born at the end of 3 BC. He was born in September, right? And then if you actually do the math, remember there's no year zero. So from 3 BC, don't count 3 because it's only a partial year. So you have 2 on the back end, and then you have 33 on the front end. So that technically would say 35, right? But he didn't make it to September of his 35th year. He was 34 and 5 months.
I always thought he was 33.
Now, if you read the text, what they suggest is that he was somewhere between 33 and 34. Most importantly, what it says is how many ministries he participated in. 3. And
Text are we talking about?
what's that?
What text? The Bible or Josephus?
Oh, that's a good question.
The question was, what text is he referencing?
That's a good question. What can I pull up? What can I pull up? Let me see if I put any of my notes here. Oh, I'm sorry. Revelation 12:1. So, here, I'll pull that up. I actually had this here. So I wanted to show this to you because this is one of the parts I got dumbfounded by this, especially as I dove into what Ophiuchus represents. So, because everyone said it was easy to see. There it is right there. There's the easy to see the woman in the sky clothed in the sun, but what's up with all the serpents? Where are the serpents? And they're there. they're symbolic because they're part of the pantheon of constellations in the sky. And the one that we call Ophiuchus used to be not one guy wrestling snakes, but 3 snakes. And then there was the Hydra underneath it. So right out of Revelation, here, let me, there it is. This is Revelation 12:1. And there appeared a great wonder in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, as I thought about this, what is the 12 stars? The 12 constellations of the zodiac, right? But she's one of them. So that would leave 11, except that there is an unofficial 13th sign of the zodiac. It's a joke, but the zodiac is defined as the constellation that the sun passes through. And the sun passes through a 13th constellation that we just conveniently ignore, and that's Ophiuchus. Not to say that that technically represents one of the 12, but if you're looking for 12, if you include her, there's 13, which give you the 12 outside of her. That's just one way to look at it. Now, the next verse, and she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in the heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon it. Now, I can't account for all the horns and crowns, but there are a bunch of serpents in the sky. And one of them, I wish I could remember its name, but its Akkadian name was something, lots of consonants. Lots of M's and Z's. I struggled to say it, but its name meant red snake. And that was the constellation just to the right of Ophiuchus, what we would call the serpent's head. That was a serpent at one point, right above Virgo. Now, I can't tie all of this, but some of this it's scripture itself that tells us September 11th. But part of it is just simple deductive reasoning, because we know that Jesus was born sometime. Here's the other before I knew about Revelation, I knew this. Jesus was born 6 months after John the Baptist. And so there's deductive clues that when they describe, see, John the Baptist's father had a role in the temple, and he had duties. And when they describe when John the Baptist was born, they're describing what his father's doing. I can't remember because I'm ignorant. I don't know what it means. I wish I could tell you, but I just know that what he did was defining the time of the year he was born. And then 6 months later, Jesus was born. And I believe that John the Baptist was born in March. It was March, right? Yeah, it was April, May, June, July, August, September. 6 months. He was born 6 months after John the Baptist. And then you have this celestial event. This is where I go back to. September 11th points to that date. I had always suspected August or September 3 BC because of the connection to John the Baptist. Then you add Revelation 12, and that's just ding, ding, ding. That's where the ink blot becomes the lobster for me. Or one of them, anyway.
Got more questions?
Sure. Oh, please, yes. So everyone can hear the questions, yes.
This is also kind of a rhetorical observation for all you children, okay? If God went to this much trouble to show us when Jesus was born, it wasn't just for God. It was to show you and an astronomer and anybody who's curious to find truth that there's truth. So all of this is about you guys.
Just a comment from the astronomy point of view. I think it's important for everybody to realize how much darker the skies were back then compared to what we're used to. This really would have stood out.
Ed is actually touching on a really good point. And so what I imagine is in 10,000 years, people are saying, they're going to be saying, you don't understand, back then, 10,000 years ago, these kids really love these things called video games. Because in the future, they won't understand that. And so back then, there is this thing called the nighttime sky. I say that because as astronomers lament is that we're losing our sky. The light pollution kind of kills our ability to see the sky. And we joke out in Mayaca You know, the light bubble in Lakewood Ranch keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the impact is that you can't see the sky. To Ed's point, what he's saying is people today are dumbfounded when they go somewhere dark and they see the sky and they go, holy cow! And I go, yeah, imagine seeing this every night of your life. That's the ancient world. And so they sat there and pondered this all the time. And I can't get any of my neighbors or friends to come over and look. I stand corrected. I know some of them have expressed some interest. But when there's an opportunity to look, it's, I got stuff to, and I'm not going to lie, even I'll go, oh, it's the Leonid meteor shower, 200, 300 meteors per hour. Oh, I'm just really tired. And so even I can lose the enthusiasm. But if you were living back then and you saw the skies, we would have been so much more deeply connected to it. And it's not to say that everyone was looking up in the sky going, oh my gosh, the protector of the Jews is meeting the protector of kings. That was the role of the Magi, in the same way that you and I can go out in the water and go look at the pretty fish, but none of us are marine biologists, right? We don't, well, not to say that we can't identify fish, but.
Howard, one other question. I'm personally curious. For years, you called this show the Star of Bethlehem.
Oh, yeah.
And for reasons I know fairly well, last year it was called the Star of Kings, and now you seem to prefer Star of Kings to Star of Bethlehem. Can you talk about that at all?
I'm going to tell it in a metaphorical way. I'm a Marine. And someone a long time ago said, call a Marine a jarhead, it'll insult him. And now Marines own that phrase, and we call ourselves jarheads. I say that because the Star of Kings was a name that the museum that I worked for came up with, because they found that the name Bethlehem was a little bit too spicy for them. I would have objected, but at the time I was only emerging from my atheist shell. And at the time, I suggested another name that I knew in my heart was appropriate and was palatable enough for them because they simply didn't understand the significance of the word. And so when I suggested to the very secular-minded people about the name transformation to the show, I said, what about Star of Kings? Because Jupiter is the planet of kings. And they went, great name, let's go with that. And so the name stuck, and we used it. And this is where I compare it to the Jarhead label. We own it now, and it's better. Yeah. And I like it, and I like this, that it began as something that was not necessarily derisive, but its origin was not an honorable one, I don't think. And that's why I love it, because we've taken it and I've owned it, and I said, nope, this is much more appropriate, and we're going to turn around and use it in a much better way. And it is, I think Star of Kings is appropriate. It is the Star of Kings. It showed up. It's still in our sky today. How should I describe this? It's like a volcano. It's still here. It's not active. It's not spewing magma, but there was a time in history when it was, and you can still see that volcano today. Jupiter is still in the sky. It's right in the sky tonight. It's out there. You can walk outside and you see how bright Jupiter is, and then you get up in the early morning and go see Venus, and then you imagine the two merging together. And then you think back to those ancient people who sat there and looked up in the sky and could see it 10,000 times better than we do today. They could probably see nebulas with their eyes. Today, we can see a handful of stars. I kind of wandered off the reservation there. Yes, sir? I'm over anxious.
Is there some significance or controversy because the Jews use lunar calendar? How did that compare to what the Magi use, and does that complicate or
yes,
make
it does.
More clear? I don't know.
So what it does is it's like saying the Americans use imperial and the Europeans use metric. And they're working together on a space project, and they're making a probe that's going to another planet. And inadvertently, one uses imperial measurements and the other uses metric, and the probe crashes into the planet. So yeah, that's a true story. A Martian probe went to Mars and crashed into the planet because the communications, one had it metric and one had it imperial, and it was a disaster for the probe. The question was, how does the Hebrew calendar affect our understanding of the metrics of time? Because they measure via using a lunar calendar, and this is the truth. When I struggled to wrap my head around the prophecy of Daniel, the 70 weeks, one of the things that I read was, when Daniel made the prophecy, he didn't specify. When he said 490 years, what did he mean? Lunar years or solar years? It's very relevant because the Hebrew culture, it was a lunar cycle, not a solar cycle. But everyone else used the solar. So which one was he referring to? He didn't specify. And when they talk about the arrival of the Anointed One, it was kind of hard to interpret this. Did he mean when he was born? Or when he was crowned king, or when he received, it was at religious maturity, spiritual maturity, or when he died? What was he really talking about? He didn't really specify. And so some of that stuff was left very ambiguous. I had no idea. And so this is what I struggled with every year before this show, was I kept trying to squeeze the prophecy of Daniel in to his birth. This is the first year I recognized, oh no, the Anointed One is cut off. And then I realized, I'm not the first guy to figure this out. I'm not doing anything new. If you really want to understand the inspiration for all of this, Ernest Martin, Dr. Ernest Martin, he's gone. He's a retired Air Force meteorologist. He dove into this, and he's the one who figured out, before there was computers, before we had access to all of this software. I've been benefiting from the software and everybody else's research on the internet. But he did it the hard way with paper and pencil to figure out what was going on, and was able to deduce that these conjunctions between the planets were so precise and they were symbolically so meaningful to the Magi that it's hard to ignore that this is the Star of Bethlehem that they're talking about. This is before nobody really knew. It wasn't until the advent of modern software. How do you recreate the view? How can you do that? And that's why they thought that Jupiter and Saturn merging together was the Christmas star, because Kepler worked it out in the 16th century that Jupiter and Saturn came together. Yeah, they did in 7 BC, but what also happened was Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter and Venus, Jupiter Regulus, all of these things happened, and he was unaware of those things. That was harder to work out, and it's modern software that opened that up. We live in an era of enormous amounts of information that are transforming the way we see the past. And this, to come full circle, is that I have found that by looking into the past, I've discovered there's so much more to the story. That's why I wished I could have, here. I wanted to look at this, because this is the part that I'm discovering. Why did Jesus die? He died for our sins. Why? Because they keep sinning over and over again. This whole time period, this is what I understand. This is the grand cycle. Because what you see is, the moment of truth is the birth of the Messiah, and then his sacrifice. He's the Lamb. I didn't understand this. He's the Lamb. Now, that's a figure of speech. Okay, whatever that means. I didn't understand what that means until I read somewhere else. What God was saying is that the sacrifice of blood, animals, is not enough to atone for our sin. This is what they keep doing this over and over and over again. There's this constant cycle. Bad kings, they keep embracing idolatry. They keep abandoning God. And here's another fascinating part. I read a historian's take on Ammon, who's Manasseh's son. This is a guy who engaged in child sacrifice. And this historian from the 40s said, oh, he was just an open-minded guy rebelling against his Yahweh iconoclasts. It sounds familiar. It sounds like people today marginalizing unacceptable behavior and those who push it. And so I see this constant lesson that it's innocuous looking. Oh, let them be. No, that's exactly what the Jewish kings did, and they got into a lot of trouble over this. They forgot God, and that's what I see today. I was a secular guy. I sat and I lived in that world. I still feel the warmth of that seat. I can get out of my spiritual seat and look back at that secular one and go, now I see. I can see the illusion. I was using this metaphor the other day. I'm like the gorilla that goes up to the mirror and goes, "Arr, arr, arr, arr." And I realized what was going on.
Howard, we have one last question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm so sorry. I actually had two questions, but one I think in a way you already answered. It's more about, because you keep repeating from the get-go that it's on 3 BC, but of course in my mind, not knowing basically nothing about the stars and those solar or differences from how we count is the birth of God, birth of Jesus. Sorry. So then, but it's also always referring to the year 0 in a way, because that's what ended up like dividing the whole history around the years. That's one. So I think that in a way you already responded with the previous question. And then the other one that goes a little bit more beyond the scope of the presentation is that when Jesus ended up dying, is there any like a reflection or anything that happens like this, the same thing that happened that you've been presenting with his birth? When he died,
he died.
Like, yeah, exactly. Something like in the stars or the constellations or the conjunctions that you've been.
I tried.
Okay.
I did. There's some mention of the sky turning dark, and here's the part. I'll tell you this because I'm a believer now, but as a secular guy, I would just say, yeah, those things didn't happen, and what was never ever possible for me to accept is that the supernatural happened. That's the part. And so here's an example. This is something else I just read this week, and I like to think. And so when I read people's words, they make me think about what were they thinking when they said it. So here's an example of this. I think I might have mentioned this already. This is Isaiah. What Isaiah says is he predicts 150 years before the event, he predicts the name of the guy who's going to free the Jews from Babylon. And he doesn't do this on accident. He almost does it on purpose, as if to say, I am telling you what's going to happen. Now, when I read this, and I read this from the perspective of a secular historian, this was his conclusion. Well, it must have been written about 400 years later, because how else did he know this? Because the idea is there's no way that God told this guy anything. They immediately abandon certain... It's like saying you would need a miracle to believe in God. And then when you see one, you disbelieve it. This is what I got out of Balaam. This is the mistake that Balaam made. He's the guy at the very beginning I showed you, gave the first stellar prophecy connected to a star. Balaam acknowledges the greatness of God and then turns his back on him. He obeys God, he recognizes his supremacy, and then works against him. What does he try to do? God tells him, bless the Israelites, leave them alone. And then he goes to the Midianites and tells them how to beat them. Introduce them to promiscuity and immorality. It cost the lives of 24,000 Israelites. God punished them and then sent the Israelites with swords to go kill the Midianites and destroy Balaam. The lesson is you don't acknowledge the greatness of God and then walk away. So this is where I am. Because God made his presence known to me, and I got to be honest with you, I'm standing here. There's a part of me that's standing over there looking at me going, what? It's still there. And I would attribute this is where I'm taking the advice of my friends and I'm saying, just open up your sail and let the wind take you where it goes. And so this is where it's taking me, and all I have to say is, in a world of disbelief, there is enough to believe in. There really is. You have to look for it. Yeah. It's there. What I would offer so that you don't feel any disappointment, you'll never get more than 50%. If 100% is 100% validation, you're never going to get more than 50%. I look back and I go back to this. I see it here. I see it in everything I find. For everything that says yes, oh my gosh, I just went back 800,000 years again. Anyway. What we have is a messianic timeline, and then we have a Roman timeline. There's one for believers, and there's one for non-believers. In other words, you have a choice. The only way God is going to earn your unconditional love is if you give it to him. He cannot demand it. He can't force you to do it. I mean, he could, but then it's not real. Then he's just Caesar. And so the only way to get true love is to let you make a choice not to. And then he has to hide himself. He's right in plain sight and invisible. I struggle because I think of those, I saw this in The Chosen, where Peter is walking towards Jesus and he's walking on water. And then he looks down. And then he goes down. And I feel like there are moments when I am with God, and I feel like I'm walking on the water, and then I do the stupid thing and I look down. It's a metaphor, but what happens is I look around me. I start to think about what's actually around me, and I lose my connection, and it's gone just like that. And I feel like I don't know, this isn't a how-to, that's not what I'm trying to get at, because we all find our own special way. I'm new at this. And I have to be honest with you, I was terrified before I came in here, because if you wanted to talk about dark matter and dark energy, quantum mechanics, the collapse of the wave function, wave-particle duality, I'm your guy. And I could do it all day long, answer every single question, tell you all about the Big Bang. But when it comes to faith, I am brand new. I just bring my same curiosity to it. And I want to understand God, and I want to understand spirituality in the same way that I understand the universe at large. And what I found is completely an absolutely wonderful thing is that I don't have to give up any of my science. And I don't want anyone here to feel like someone can use their science to tell you God doesn't exist. It is not, that's not the way it is. It's not the way it is. Anyway, I know, I'm looking for ways to keep you here. So, thank you very much. Oh, sure, one last question.
I'm just saying that this has been a revelation to me, because I came in expecting to hear about the Star of Bethlehem, and I'm talking about the Christmas card, Bethlehem, and that's not what we learned tonight at all. So the Star of Kings, in a sense, is easier to separate.
Star of Bethlehem is a geographical thing, and the Star of Kings is eternal.
Yeah. Well, but I'm talking about time. I'm talking about 10 months of time, actual time, between the birth of Jesus and
The arrival of the Magi?
Yes.
It's about 14 months.
20, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I didn't, this is new. I expected something, not that.
Nativity scenes are just a little bit wrong. Just a little bit. Yeah.
One thing that my husband used to say when they would ask him, how can a Christian, you say you're a Christian and you believe in science. And he said, well, science is just uncovering the law of God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For Mary, can I introduce you?
Yes, please.
For those of you that don't know, Mary, a dear friend of our family, Mary Irwin was married to Jim Irwin, who was the lunar module pilot for Apollo 15. There is a Bible on the moon that is his. It's still there today. Mary and her family are here tonight with us. It was a tradition when we were at the museum, they would come for the Star of Bethlehem. Sometimes I'd only see them that once for the year.
It's true.
But it was always followed by hot chocolate and dessert over at Madison's. It was one of our traditions.
Mary,
So I'm.
What was that quote that your husband used on the moon?
Yes.
Oh yeah, here.
Yes, walking on Jesus, walking on. Yeah.
Tell everybody that.
Well, when he would speak in churches or schools, he would always tell them that the most important thing in life was Jesus walking on the earth was more important than man walking on the moon.
Thank you, everybody. Oh, sorry.
Can we just honor and thank Howard one more time for real?
He's going to come tackle you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm overwhelmed right now.
Howard's whispering how overwhelmed he is, and I don't think there's anyone in here who would say they're not overwhelmed. You've overwhelmed us, and the Lord's presence has overwhelmed us for the uncovering of the truth.
Thank you, Chris.
It's awesome.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you for the
Howard.
opportunity, everybody.
Yeah.
Because I'm not in a planetarium anymore. This, for all intents and purposes, this is the show for this year. And we used to give about 4, sometimes 6 shows a year, and they were always sellouts. For what it's worth, this is the biggest audience I've ever had. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
And along those lines, I'm going to tell you, so my name's Chris Welty. I'm one of the pastors here at this church. We have a basket on the front right here. It's a little basket. If you have been blessed tonight, this was something that was normally charged for at the planetarium. We're doing this kind of over Howard's objection, actually.
Yes.
But we're doing it anyway. So if you're blessed tonight, drop some money in there. If you don't have any cash or check with you, you can go to our website, fobfamily.com, and give online and memo it Star of Kings, and we'll just pass that right on through to Howard and his family. Could we just stop one moment and just pray a blessing over him and his family real quick? Just just agree with me here, okay? We don't pray alone in this church. Psalms 19:1. The heavens declare your glory, and the skies declare your handiwork. And what incredible handiwork it is. As was shared tonight, you've left breadcrumbs hiding in plain sight. I thank you for the hours this man has poured into this, and I thank you for the anointing and the calling that you've placed upon him, Lord, to do it. We see this is just the beginning. So, Father, we say, bless Howard and Kristen and their 4 children. Bless the work of their hands. We thank you for what you've deposited in them, and through that into us. May it go far and wide from this place. This is just the beginning. Thank you for bringing us together tonight, Lord. If there's anyone here at the beginning of the journey, and they haven't emerged yet, as Howard has said, Lord, we just thank you for the seeds planted, and we say fruit in the name of Jesus.
Amen.
Bless you, Lord. Amen. There's cookies and hot chocolate and stuff out.
By the way, I've wanted to make this available. This timeline is accessible on the internet. I don't know how to tell you to get to it. Okay, I was going to say I wanted to put it up there, but I'm 505 million. It is It's on the web, so if you want to, you can peruse this at your leisure. I will be. It's a work in progress, so I'll constantly be adding to it, and hopefully next year it'll be even more populated with more stuff I won't be able to talk about in the show because it'll just mean more time. But
Did they give you their email address?
Absolutely, or you can Facebook me. I'm on Facebook. Well, I was, but now I'm actually monitoring it. Yeah. I never did before.